For as long as there's been Major League Baseball, there's also been controversy around the sport, whether it's the Black Sox scandal or Pete Rose betting on games. You have the steroid era of the 90s and early 2000s, and most recently the Houston Astros illegally stealing signs to give their hitters an unfair advantage. And we as fans and viewers, we don't like when things are unfair, and the media knows that, and they're quick to scoop up these kind of stories and blow them up because they know that's going to get our emotions going and get all sorts of clicks. And I couldn't help but think about the way that this whole Astros scandal is being covered by the media, because anybody can do a blog or a podcast and give their own opinion, but it's different when you have a big media outlet giving their own opinion, whether consciously or subconsciously, on a story as big as this. So for my capstone research, I decided to compare the Houston Chronicle, a local newspaper for the Astros, with the ESPN coverage of the scandal, and just wanted to compare the similarities and the differences in how they were covering the Astros cheating scandal. And what I found was that they were actually remarkably similar, which you might not expect. Given that one's the local and one's national, you might expect the national one to just bash the team, while the local paper is more defensive and understanding of the team. But that wasn't really the case. And so my thesis for my capstone was that although there were some instances where you could see an agenda being pushed, both the Houston Chronicle and ESPN fairly and accurately covered the scandal. So before I get into some of the examples in the articles that I analyzed, I'll give a little information on the theory that I was applying in my research. So, known as the Agendasetting Theory, it was introduced by McCombs in 1972, and McCombs did an experiment before the 1972 election where he compared the local news articles that were being published with what the voters of that area said were important issues to them. And what McCombs found was that the issues that voters believed were important matched remarkably similarly with the issues that were being published the most frequently by the local newspaper. And so he theorized that, and this is a quote, "The mass media force attention to certain issues. They are constantly presenting objects, suggesting what individuals in the mass should think about, know about, and have feelings about." And that's really the premise of the agenda setting theory, but there's also another aspect to this, and that's in the way that the media frames the story, because not only are they telling us what to think about, but they're also telling us in what ways to think about it, just in the way that they give us the story. So for example, if a newspaper is just subtly defensive of the Astros in this scandal, saying maybe that people are treating them too harshly, whether they're intending to do that or not, they're framing the story in a way that's going to probably get people to think more favorably of the team and that they're being treated unfairly. So what I did in my research was I analyzed five articles from both the Houston Chronicle and from ESPN, and just compared and looked at how they were being framed. And what I did was I used a coding system. I coded all the headlines and phrases in the articles as either favorable coverage of the Astros, unfavorable coverage of the Astros, or neutral coverage. And then I tallied up the score of each. So for every instance where there was favorable coverage of the Astros, I subtracted a point, and every time there was unfavorable coverage of the Astros, I added a point. So in theory, the most fair articles would have a perfect score of 0, and the more biased ones are either going to have an extremely positive score or an extremely negative score. So I won't talk about all 10 articles that I analyzed because that would take too much time, first of all, and then you wouldn't have any reason to read my paper, so we don't want that. The first article that I will talk about briefly is an article by the Houston Chronicle titled Astros Situation Amid Cheating Scandal Stinks, Josh Reddick says. Just without even reading this article, you can already kind of see the way that the story is being framed. Just saying it simply as it stinks really makes it sound like Josh Reddick, a player for the Astros, is really kind of missing the point, and he's downplaying the significance of the scandal. And reading and digging into the article, that was indeed the case. There's one pretty blatant quote that gives this away, which says, Josh Reddick offered scant specifics, afforded the opportunity, the outfielder did not signal any regret. The scandal has cost 4 men their jobs, called into question the legitimacy of the 2017 World Series championship, and thrown the Astros into immediate upheaval. That's just a very, very pointed quote, really trying to build up the implications of the scandal, saying it cost people their jobs, and the World Series, the legitimacy of it is being called into question, and just all these things. And then with the headline, Josh Reddick saying, oh, well, that stinks. You can very easily see the way that this is being framed, with the author obviously not taking too kindly to Reddick's response to all this. Another article from the Houston Chronicle that I looked at, which was pretty different in the take that they had, was titled Dodgers Cody Bellinger says Astros Jose Altuve stole MVP. And this one you had to dig into a little bit, but there was 2 main quotes that I thought were kind of telling of what the author's opinion was. The first one being, cheating by stealing signs is a particularly sore subject in the Dodgers clubhouse. Saying it's a sore subject is just kind of awkward phrasing. It makes it sound like the Dodgers are just being bad losers when the Astros cheated to win. And the other quote in this article says, Bellinger saved most of his vitriol Friday for the Astros players, especially Jose Altuve. If you're not familiar with the word vitriol, it means cruel or bitter criticism. So that's a very strong choice of words to use. And saying that it's cruel or bitter kind of makes it sound like it's unnecessarily harsh. And just it's almost deflecting the blame, even though the Astros were the ones cheating, and kind of putting it on Cody Bellinger and the Dodgers. So one ESPN article that I will mention briefly was titled What to Make of Houston Astros Owner Jim Crane's Public Non-Apology. If you can't tell from that headline, this author is, of course, not satisfied with the response to the cheating scandal that the Astros owner gave, calling it a non-apology in the headline. And this was the most egregiously biased article that I read by far. Coding it was actually very difficult because almost every single word and phrase was so biased against the Astros that just separating them into separate points was very difficult. To give you an idea of that, here's one kind of lengthy quote. Crane claimed his team's routine cheating during its 2017 championship season didn't impact the game, declared he shouldn't be held accountable for the organization he runs, used Commissioner Rob Manfred's report on the Astros' malfeasance as a binky, and so often repeated talking points that the apology.exe program he tried to install in his head looked as if it were glitching. The entire charade devolved into a glorious conflagration, Crane's mouth a veritable fountain of lighter fluid. So just strong adjective and verb after another, just bashing the owner and the organization, the players, repeatedly. And that was this entire article. just one more example from the article at the very end. It says, Crane, after all, still denies there's a problem with the Astros culture. Perhaps his mirror is just broken. Of course, me not being an Astros fan, I kind of agree with the take that the author's taking, but it'd be very difficult to say that he's not being unfair and biased in the way that this is being framed. Obviously very negative towards the Astros. So when I looked at the final results here, the tally of the 5 articles from each that I analyzed, it was very fascinating in a couple different ways. So 2 of the articles from the Houston Chronicle framed the Astros negatively, which you might not expect, and 3 of them were slightly positive takes on the Astros. Whereas for ESPN, 3 of their articles actually scored a neutral rating, while 2 had a negative frame, of course with the one being extremely negative against the Astros. With the Houston Chronicle articles, another thing that I thought was interesting was that both of the articles that reflected negatively on the Astros were written by the same person, and 2 of the articles that reflected positively on the Astros were written by the same person. So I thought that it was kind of interesting that both negative were written by one person and 2 positive were written by another person. So it kind of seemed to me like maybe there wasn't so much bias by the outlet as a whole as maybe the individuals writing for the Houston Chronicle. If you wanted to declare, I guess, a winner in who had better coverage, personally, I wouldn't really be comfortable doing that, simply because I only looked at a total of 10 articles, and I don't think that's really sufficient to claim one was better than the other, because this is a controversy that came out in November, so we've had half a year of information coming out between the first time that the story broke and the investigation, the results of the investigation, the press conference the Astros held, just all sorts of information that's come out, and there's just thousands upon thousands of articles that have been published on this story. So if I was going to try and declare which outlet covered the story better, you would definitely need to do a lot more analysis, looking at hundreds or if not thousands of articles before you make any kind of determination there. But if you're really curious just on the analysis that I did, ESPN had more neutral articles with 3, but the Houston Chronicle had a lower mean score. So on average, they were closer to 0 than they were than the ESPN articles were. But that was mostly just because of that one ESPN article that really threw off the mean, because it had such a high score of 30 something, whereas every other article that I analyzed was between like -3 and +3. So it's, I guess, if you were going to declare a winner, ESPN was maybe a little more fair in their coverage just based on the articles that I looked at, but again, hardly conclusive because it's such a small sample size that I was working with here for the purpose of this research. So you could definitely see instances where the Houston Chronicle and ESPN were negatively covering the Astros, and there was also instances where you could see them positively covering, but I think it was 8 out of the 10 articles were between that -3 and +3, and then there was one that was a little outside that, and then the one egregious one from ESPN. So really both of these outlets fairly covered the scandal.